Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. Now, of course, it's no surprise that we're going to continue to discuss, firstly, in today's show, the U.S. elections and the continuing fallout from that. We obviously have Donald Trump, who continues to speak about vote rigging, saying that there is major vote rigging happening, even though there hasn't yet been any evidence shown to prove that on his part or on the part of his supporters. There are protests, confusing protests, if I may say, one saying that every vote should be counted and the other saying vote counts should stop. Even Donald Trump tweeting that the count needs to stop. Convinced that he would win, according to his own statements, if, quote unquote, only the legal votes were to be counted. Vice President Biden has asked for calm, has asked for time, saying that every vote should be counted, has not yet declared victory, even though he is fairly close, according to the Associated Press and some other media outlets, about how close he is to getting that 270 magic number of Electoral College votes. Let's discuss all of this a bit further. We're now joined by Dr. Sharon, who is Professor of Political Science at the University of Florida. She's also editor of the American Political Science Review. She's joining us this morning from Middleburg, Florida. Joining us from Bogota, Colombia is Dr. Dorian Kantor, who is a professor of international relations and political science at Pontificia Universidad Javeriana. Dorian and Sharon, good morning to you both, and thank you for joining us here in Scope. Dorian, let me start with you. What do you make of the continuing fallout and the way things are playing out right now in the U.S.? You know, it's not like this is the first time it's taken a number of days for the result to come out, has it?
Good morning, Waqar, and thanks for having me. No, this is not the first time that this is happening. As a matter of fact, something very similar happened in 2000. We had to wait much longer for the actual election results to come in. So this is neither unexpected nor unprecedented. And as a matter of fact, just what you were referring to, that Donald Trump was not going to accept the election results. This is also not unexpected, because we heard this from his campaign, that he was likely going to go on national TV to say that he was not going to accept the election results, especially the ones that are coming in now through the mailing ballots.
Sharon, what are your thoughts about how things are playing out right now? Right, there's just this continuing feeling that things may get worse vis-a-vis unrest.
Right, exactly. I think that the Trump campaign has already filed lawsuits, and if he loses the election, which it's looking like he definitely will, he will continue to do that. He even wants to go to the Supreme Court. That, of course, happened in 2000 with Bush v. Gore. The difference is this is the first time that a sitting president has done this, has filed lawsuits and wants to go to the Supreme Court. But it's not at all surprising, because for months he's been saying that he felt that this election would be stolen from him. And when the polls started to show that he was behind in some of the battleground states, he started saying that the election would be rigged. So really, this isn't surprising at all.
All right, so let's talk about then the details then, Dorian. Donald Trump saying that, the legal action that he's going to put forth, a lot of people saying that that won't work. But do you think that he has a case, a legitimate case, to put this, to put his grievances about how this election has played out to even the Supreme Court?
So probably not, or actually very likely not. Some of the challenges that they have filed in court are challenges that are, first of all, not very well founded. They are challenging very minor aspects of the counting process, the tabulation process. They're saying some of their observers were not allowed close enough to observe the process. And actually, in one particular case, in Philadelphia, the judge actually said that a conservative judge who was appointed by a Republican president, that the Trump administration was engaging in disenfranchisement. So in this respect, it's very difficult to see whether the Trump administration would be able to mount a legal challenge that would hold any water whatsoever. But right now, it seems as though most of the challenges have to do with proximity of the observers, and the only legal challenge that seems perhaps that might be that it might stick would be in Pennsylvania, where some of the votes will be allowed to be counted if they arrive by Friday at 5 p.m. So today, 5 p.m. Eastern time. However, this might become a case that could reach the Supreme Court only if those few votes would determine who wins in Pennsylvania and who loses.
Sharon, does it even matter really if we have a legal case or not? Because I would think that, and it seems quite likely that in the hearts and minds of enough Americans, there are now those seeds of doubt that Donald Trump has planted, that it doesn't really matter whether or not there's a legal fight or not. This will be a very hard win, even if Biden does win and is confirmed that as the president-elect. It'll be very hard for him to convince everybody, won't it?
I don't know necessarily if that's true, because if he wins Georgia, which he's got a slight lead there by about 1,000 votes, if he comes back and if he wins Pennsylvania, which is being projected that he probably will, and if he wins Nevada, some places have already called Arizona for Biden, he'll have 306 electoral votes, which is the exact same numbers what President Trump had 4 years ago. And so if that be the case, I think that the American public, the majority of people will believe that Biden won. And he also is ahead by approximately 4 million popular votes as well. So it's not a repeat of 4 years ago when Hillary Clinton won the popular vote and Donald Trump won the electoral vote. This is not a repeat of that. So there are always going to be some people who are not going to like the result, regardless of the outcome. But I think that if by chance Biden wins those states, or even if he just barely gets 270 electoral votes, he is the winner. And then also there will be a recount in these states, because in most states there's a law that requires a recount if the vote is less than 1% or 2% of the vote. So President Trump will get his recount, which he is entitled to, which the nation is entitled to. But usually recounts always confirm what we already know, which is that a person won, even if that person won by a narrow margin.
But all of this, Dorian, leaves a bitter taste in the mouth, doesn't it? I mean, the way that this is all worked out, the doubts, the rhetoric, all of the above doesn't really bode well, does it, for A, polarization within American society, and B, just the democratic process?
Right. You're exactly right. And it appears at this point that Donald Trump's strategy through these various legal challenges that they're mounting is not so much to actually have an outcome that would benefit the president. It seems like the point is, like you said, to sow doubt in the electoral process. And so sort of to cast a shadow of doubt on the integrity of this election. It is difficult to see, like Sharon said, it is difficult to see, how Biden's victory in the end would not be seen as legitimate. As a matter of fact, when we're talking about a mandate, so if he wins, let's say with 270 electoral votes, that would be the lowest number of electoral votes in the 20th century. If he does, if he's able to eke out, let's say Georgia, Pennsylvania, which both states right now appear like Biden will eventually prevail over Donald Trump. Then, in terms of the electoral aspect, Joe Biden will have plenty of legitimacy and plenty of a mandate. Donald Trump's strategy right now is more of a PR stunt, right? He's trying to cast doubt on the electoral process, cast doubt on the legitimacy and the integrity of this election, just in case he is able to get the requisite number of electoral votes. And in that case, he could still make kind of the same argument that he did in 2016. He didn't have a lot of electoral votes, but still, he is the winner and he does have a mandate. I think that's their game plan right now.
All right, I'll give you the final word then. The key here is peaceful transfer of power, right? And there was, I believe, not too long ago, that controversy about Donald Trump saying, passing doubt on whether or not he would transfer power peacefully, if he would go quietly, essentially, and do the mature thing as previous presidents have, hand over power to the president-elect. Do you think Donald Trump would really go that far, where he would not necessarily incite violence directly, but would incite people to come out on the streets and create the kind of instability that I would imagine would be a nightmare for any president-elect?
I think that's exactly what he's trying to do, not necessarily to incite violence, but he is trying to motivate his supporters to, he's trying to convince them that he's being cheated, that the election process is unfair and that it's being rigged, that he actually won. And I think that's exactly what he wants to do, is for people to go to the streets and to protest. But even if that happens, it's going to be a very ugly situation here in America. But nevertheless, once the result is out there and if Biden actually wins, then President Trump can continue to complain. But at some point, he's going to have to accept the results, regardless of the outcome of the election. And he can't continue to do this, but he's going to continue to, because simply that's just that's what he does.
We'll leave there as a final word, but we appreciate both Sharon and Dorian for their time this morning and for sharing their thoughts with us, because, this process continues. As of this recording, we're at 253, according to some media outlets in the U.S., and 264, according to the Associated Press, electoral college votes, that is, for Joe Biden. He is that close right now to that 270 number. Will he go over that? Will he hit that mark tonight, today? We don't know how much longer this all will take, but how will Donald Trump accept and or not whatever the final result is, if it does not work out in his favor? And that's something that we're going to keep a very close eye on here in Scope. I'll be back with my next segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. Now, in this segment, we're going to begin discussing, I should say, in fact, France. And there's a lot to discuss, certainly, when it comes to France, especially its relations with its own Muslim citizens, in the wake of course, those horrible attacks on innocent people in France as well, which, of course, there is no justification for. Nevertheless, in the fallout from those events, there is now a disturbing pattern, as there has been for a number of years now, vis-a-vis how France's relations with its Muslim citizens are developing. So we have the Interior Minister, who now says that anyone seeking medical care who refuses to be treated by a woman or person essentially of the opposite gender will then be fined and or even possibly jailed, I believe. 5 years in prison is the number, and 75,000 euros is the fine. At the same time, we also have then Emmanuel Macron writing in the Financial Times, having essentially an article suspended, I believe, temporarily, which was critical of France's relations with the Muslims, talking, I believe at least, I'm going to put this to my guess, exaggerating a bit about how 3-year-olds in the country are wearing face veils. I mean, that just seems to defy logic. Of course, there are extreme cases in every faith group, but it seems that he's generalizing a tad bit too much when it comes to that letter that he wrote in the Financial Times as well. Then we have positive stories as well, where the Archbishop of Toulouse has spoken about opposing the publishing of the caricatures of Prophet Muhammad, saying that this was not good for either Islam or Christians alike, for Muslims and Christians alike, I should say, and that there are limits to freedom of speech. Those things, of course, are something that can be debated. And finally, before I get to my guests, I also wanted to mention that 20 Muslim European groups, essentially of the youth throughout Europe, have written an open letter to Emmanuel Macron asking him to stop the sort of pattern of overgeneralizing the situation vis-a-vis when it comes to its own Muslim citizens and its treatment of them. Let's discuss all of those issues a bit further. We're now joined by Dr. Raphael Liogier, who is a professor of the sciences politics, visiting researcher at Columbia University. He's also a teacher at the International College of Philosophy and a researcher at Sophia Pol. He's joining us today from Marseille. Joining us from Lyon is Monia, who is a member of the Coordination Against Racism and Islamophobia. Monia and Raphael, thank you both for your time today. Monia, I'd like to start with you. I know there's a lot to discuss, so I'm going to just ask you more of a macro question here, but just if we can hone in on the Interior Minister and how he's been speaking about Muslims, talking about how halal food is available in markets and how he's disturbed by that. What does that say to you about the relationship right now between Muslim citizens and their government?
Yeah, thank you for asking that question. The Muslim community is concerned because political leaders are targeting us as the enemy within. And the situation is getting worse, undoubtedly worse for Muslims, because we have become the #1 targets of racists in the Western world, and especially in France. So we have the impression that Muslims are not allowed to have any different point of view, any disagreement in this so-called country of human rights. So Emmanuel Macron delivered a speech about the so-called Islamist separatism, but we actually have the impression that this is just a political strategy to divert French people's attention from our real issues. We're going through a historical crisis, which is COVID-19, and believe it or not, but there is poverty actually in this country, unemployment, and we consider that there are more serious problems, more serious issues in this country than just being involved in our religious matters.
Raphael, what are your thoughts on that? Because, it's not like Muslims are new in France, right? So I would imagine that there is also then the question of timing, because I know that there is a political reality to all of this as well, where we know Marine Le Pen is doing better in the polls than Emmanuel Macron is right now.
Everything has changed in 2003, actually. After the Iraq War, the second Iraq War, because it is the first time in French history and even in European history that the first military and economic power, which is the US, didn't ask their advice to France or anybody. They just went there and they said, if you don't want to come, don't come, because we don't really care about you anymore. You are our ally, but we don't really care because you don't count anymore. And at that time in 2003, there was some kind of beginning of a huge identity crisis for Europeans in general and French in particular. And it is specifically at that time, 2003, that you have all those new parties all over Europe that we call now populist party, that are feeding this idea that we are surrounded by enemies, that the world is not ours anymore, we are not the center of the world. And France was touched even more, because France doesn't even consider itself as the center of Europe. It considers itself as the center of Europe, which considers itself as the center of the world. And so there was some kind of an identity crisis. I will say a collective narcissistic crisis. And so it's not only phobia, it's usually analyzed like phobia, but the Muslims, they become as it was said by the other person you interviewed, the enemy inside, within, but not only as a phobia, but as a paranoia. The difference between phobia and paranoia is that with paranoia, you think that the other has an intention. He wants to kill you. He's everywhere. So if you don't understand that it's collective paranoia that is directly related to an identity crisis, you don't understand why every time there is a simple veil or something like that, people think it's like an attack, which it is not,
Yeah, no, that's the point. Monia, I wonder, what then can and should the Muslim community be doing at this point, right? Because as you can imagine, at least the narrative in general public and in the rest of the world on the outside is that, that there is a problem of radicalism, etc., within the Muslim community. But at the same time, it's also been shown by a number of Muslims that, in fact, a lot of these sorts of extremists have actually been reported by Muslims themselves to authorities, to warn them that something might happen because of this person's extremism. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, I think it's some sort of vicious circle. Whenever there is a terrorist attack, it increases Islamophobia. And we condemn terrorism. 99.99% of the Muslim community in France is against violence. We strongly condemn terrorist attacks. But this vicious circle, makes it very complicated for us, because terrorist attacks increase Islamophobia, and Islamophobia is a tool for recruiting terrorists. So we believe that voting a law about the so-called Islamist separatism will only amount to play the game of terrorists who use racism as a pretext to recruit people who are usually young and disoriented. So I think our message is pretty clear and simple to understand. In order to coexist peacefully in this country and stop the fury of terrorism, I think our leaders must stop targeting Muslims as the enemy within. It only reminds us of the 1930s in France when the Jews were pointed at by the government as the enemy within. So history is repeating itself, and I think we should learn from our mistakes. And us Muslims would like our country to defend our rights. We want to be considered as fully fledged citizens and to be treated equally, just like the other communities in France. So, yeah, that's basically...
Yeah. All right, Raphael, I'll give you the final word before I let both of you go. On this point of, again, Muslims being citizens of France, so it's a very important point, right? Because for a while now, it's been, at least a conversation that I've read a lot seems to almost keep them outside the citizenry, where it's spoken of that, that group of people. And they're not really spoken of in terms as the rest of French society. What does that say about how France, again, thinks about its own citizens? Because that's worrying, isn't it? These are people who have been there, some of them for generations.
But, as I told you earlier, from 2003, the very meaning of laicity and the Republic has changed. It became some kind of an instrument to target a part of the population this part of the population is composed actually of French citizens, the Muslim, as being the enemy within. Well, laicity, historically, is to allow people to express their religious faith. It's not to forbid it. But for Muslims, it became a way to forbid it, which is the other way of what is laicity. But I will just add something else about the idea of radicalism and terrorism. Because I was the first expert to be interviewed by the French Parliament in 2015, just in January, just after the terrorist attack, because I used to run the first research center in France, Observatoire du Religieux, Religious Watch, that studied the profile of the terrorist. And what I said at that time, it's exactly what I would say now. We observe sociologically, it's not a prejudice, it's not just sociologically, that you don't have an actual process of a linear process of people that, as the government will try to say, that the more they are Muslim in their external expression, in the way they practice, etc., the more chance they have to commit terrorism. We don't observe that at all. We actually observe the opposite. The more they are Muslim, even when they are very radical, the more they are against terrorism. While, in fact, we have other groups that are not at first Muslim, but they desire to become directly terrorists, like jihadists, because Islam has this image of being at war with the West. Such an image is actually fed by the government out of this paranoia. Because for the law you were talking about against separatism and the fact that you forbid women to decide that she wants to be healed by a physician that will be a woman. I just want to say one thing: it is just not possible. It's unconstitutional, because even someone that is an adult can refuse as a whole he can refuse a medical protocol because he doesn't agree with. If he's an adult, he sign it and he can refuse it, and he doesn't go to prison for that. So a woman, she can decide what she wants. It will be against the very constitution of France since 1789, since the revolution. So it's just not possible. It's pure populism to say that.
All right, Raphael and Monia, we really appreciate you taking your time out of your busy schedules to share your thoughts with us on these very important developments that are coming out of France for a while now. Raphael, they're speaking to us from Marseille, and Monia was speaking to us from Lyon. We will continue this discussion about France right after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. We're continuing our discussion on all the developments coming out of France and related to, of course, its own Muslim citizens in the wake, of course, as I said in my introduction as well, those horrible attacks on innocents, which, of course, are not justified in any way, shape, or form. Nevertheless, the country's relations with its own Muslim citizenry has been degrading for a while now. That is, of course, a worrying development that needs to be, of course, tackled and dealt with. Well, let's discuss all of that a bit further with Dr. Simon Dawes, who is a senior lecturer at the Université de Versailles, Saint-Quentin-aux-Yvelines, who is joining us from Versailles. Joining us from Vienna is Dr. Farid Hafez, who is a lecturer and researcher at the University of Salzburg at the Department of Political Science and Sociology. Farid and Simon, thank you both for your time today. Farid, let me start with you. There was that Financial Times letter, which I'm sure you've read, that Macron has written in response to an article that was critical of France, again, its relations with Muslims, its Islamophobia, etc. That article, I believe, has been temporarily removed. But in that letter, Macron has made some claims about, how 3-year-olds in France are wearing face veils. It seems that these are quite exaggerated claims to be making. Do you think he's very much still feeding into, this anti-Muslim sentiment rather than trying to control it?
I would even rather speak not of anti-Muslim sentiment, but of anti-Muslim racism. So I think the structure that we find in France, is that Muslims are made invisible, or the state tries to make them invisible. Just think of all the hijab bans in the past for school pupils and so on and so forth. So the whole notion of what it means to be a French white secular citizen is actually very exclusionary to the identity and existence of Muslim people to live their religion in freedom and in equality. So I think this is really what is at stake, and what Emmanuel Macron is furthering here is just an old policy that we do not only know from the last decades, but really even we can go back to the colonial time when French colonizers were eager to make French women free and to protect them from bad Muslim men and a submissive religion, how they saw it, right?
Simon, I wonder, what are your thoughts on how exactly France then aims to have good relations with its own Muslim citizens, because they are very much still part and parcel of French society. They've been there, many of them, for generations. So it's not like this is a brand new population that's just come in waves or something. You need to somehow get along, right?
I think the first problem really with that in France is that there is this obsession with the idea that France is an indivisible republic, so that you don't make distinctions between French citizens. So first of all, you would have to acknowledge the existence of Muslims within France, which is a problem. So if you don't recognize the existence of Muslims, then it's very difficult to talk about intercultural relations, and social cohesion and things like that. So just making that distinction is problematic. And many people in France would even say that is in itself racist, to recognize that Muslims, that the French Muslim is a category, that there is perhaps differences between how French Muslims see a particular issue and how other French people see it, which then means it's also difficult to talk about racism and Islamophobia and recognizing alternative viewpoints and making this particular community visible. Just the very idea of doing that is something that many people would consider racist in itself. So the result is that we have an invisible community within the public.
That's interesting. But, there was the interior minister, right, who made a comment, I believe, soon after the attacks, that he went into a market and saw halal meat, I think it was, being sold, and he was worried about that. And now there's a talk of that bill about, how Muslims essentially would not be able to choose doctors, or just anybody would not be able to choose or to reject a doctor of the opposite gender if he or she so wishes, even though, as we know, it's an international human right, really, to be able to have the freedom to choose your own doctor. This is all getting a bit out of hand, isn't it?
Well, absolutely. And I think it reveals very much a very problematic trend that we can observe, not only in France, but throughout a lot of Western European countries. This problematic tendency, as I see it, is that many countries move in a very authoritarian direction. And, you know, everything you just mentioned reveals actually a very totalitarian notion of how the state can deal with its citizens. I mean, this should not only make Muslims worry, but like all of the population, all of the citizens in those countries, like we have to think about, like, if the state is treating and positioning himself vis-a-vis his citizens in this way, trying to impose very strict measures and what is a good behavior and what is not a good behavior. Like this totalitarian ideology, this can tomorrow or the day after really be also adopted vis-a-vis other minorities that are marginalized, that are vulnerable, like Muslims are. Like Muslims are the working poor, right, in France. So they are not the ones who have the power really to define their role in the society, because they are just not given any place, any space in the French society, which is a deeply racist and using a society that uses secularism as an ideology to exclude the Muslims from a shared understanding of French society that is inclusive. So I think really what is at stake here is not only Islamophobia and Muslim minorities. What is at stake is the future of Europe and how European countries see themselves in terms of the role of citizens and its relationship to the state authorities.
You know, there is a huge political context to all of what is happening, right? I mean, Marine Le Pen is doing well in the polls, I believe. Emmanuel Macron is not doing as well as her. That in and of itself is also a worrying trend, right? Where Macron is sort of forced to be a lot more right-wing than maybe he would have wanted to have been. What does that also then say about the rise of the right, or the entire society moving ever more right?
Yeah, I think that's the kind of thing which is not just the case for France. We have the same thing in the UK and other European countries. So certainly the influence of the far right as a political force and the potential for them to have their candidate become president soon is very real. So then you have parties on the centre-right adopting the same discourse as the far right. So even if you vote for someone who is not from the far right, you're probably going to vote for someone who has the same policies as the far right. Macron himself, yes, was very moderate when he was doing his campaign to become president. He's someone who has actually spoken about the negative aspects of French colonialism, which many people do not do in France, and he received a lot of criticism for that. But he has been turning more to the right recently. Also, the crackdown on Muslims at the moment is part of a wider influence of authoritarianism within Macron's government, which is not just against Muslims. We've seen violent police crackdowns on the Yellow Vest supporters and things like that. There's a bill underway at the moment to stop people filming the police so that we can't see police violence anymore. And the government refused to accept criticisms of police violence. They refused to accept criticisms of state racism and things like that. But there is also the influence of the left in France, which is unique in a way to France. It's not just the far right that are criticizing Muslims and having conspiracy theories about Sharia law in certain areas, or an Islamist conspiracy theory going to take over the country. We have people on the Republican left who are very proud of secularism, and their interpretation of secularism is not just that we have a neutral state where we encourage religious freedom in the public. Their interpretation is anti-religious, and therefore they have a big problem with visible religion, so they don't like veils or beards or things like that, or halal meat. The minister who criticised halal meat also criticised kosher as well. Yeah. So yeah, it's not just against Muslims, it's potentially against other groups. as well.
Yeah.
So yeah, the political context is certainly important, but it's not just about the risk from the far right. There is also a risk from the Republican left, with a very powerful movement called Printemps Républicain, Republican Spring, which is probably about to become a political party. They're very close to Manuel Valls, former prime minister. So there's also a threat to Macron from this potential new movement from the left as well.
Right, Farid, that was a very important point that Simon there made, and he did, and I'm glad he brought up the issue of the kosher meat too, because that's also important to point out, right, that when you have prejudice or bias towards any group of people, so here we're talking about Muslims, for example, that also is very connected to racism towards others, right? So we can talk about racism in France towards, people of color in general, and then, of course, when you have the rise of the right, then you also do have elements of anti-Semitism that come along with that as well, don't they?
Well, absolutely. I mean, what I see here is, there is a history of racism, and Europe is simply speaking just not in the position to grapple with its own history of racism, of colonialism. The Jewish community is, again, I think, something in a very special position, because there is this whole idea after the end of the Second World War that Jews, in a way, have to be integrated into the European project, which not really happened, but there are some alignments, and in some ways they happen to have become parts of the elite also. But in general, yes, Islamophobia comes with anti-Semitism, comes with sexism, comes with other kinds of mechanisms of oppression and ideologies to privilege the dominant society and exclude the marginalized and the poor working people. So this is something, I think, even if you look into the history, a lot of the things that are happening today with Muslims, we know this exactly, even one-to-one from what happened to the Jewish community more than 100 years ago. And I'm speaking about the interwar period even before the First World War. So I'm not speaking and not referring to the Holocaust, but what I'm referring to is the whole political debate. So there is a number of things that happened in the past with the Jewish community that we are now witnessing the Muslim communities going through.
Indeed. We'll have to leave it there at that as our final point, but we do sincerely appreciate both Simon and Farid for taking their time out of their busy schedules to share their expertise and thoughts with us on the situation there in France. Farid speaking to us there from Vienna, and Simon was speaking to us today from Versailles. As I said, the situation of Muslims in France, it's not like they're new, right? So the country to now be turning against these citizens who have been around for so long, who are so integrated into society, are working alongside other French citizens to now make a target out of them. I mean, it just defies logic, and it's hard to understand what exactly is the end goal here. Is it that they want Muslims to all leave France, to completely give up their respective faith altogether, to not have any outward symbols of their faith? I mean, will they do that to the Jews, God forbid, or the Sikhs or others who have outward symbols, or even Christians who wear the cross, for example? I mean, will all of that be outlawed then? And is that the kind of society we want, even in a country which prides itself on its secularism, but at the same time also says that it does allow for religions to thrive within it? I mean, those two messages that Macron seems to be wanting to sell to the rest of the world just don't seem to necessarily work side by side. Again, just logically, it does not make sense. I'll leave it there for now. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.